Well, hi, it's Peter here. Today we are going to start this course with the first lecture on the Asian business and management systems, which I think is quite interesting considering all the developments that's going on in Asia at this point, with so many different things happening, not to mention the monetary war that is about to take place, or hopefully it won't, but we never know. There might be things that we can in fact analyze with help from what's written in this book. By the way, it's the book of I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, but it's by Hasegawa and Noronha on the Asian business and management, where I think that we can find some interesting viewpoints that can explain today's developments. And I do hope that we will see some interesting perhaps explanations, perhaps some questions that we also need to ask ourselves. What's going on, given the fact that we are looking into a very interesting region with a lot of things happening all around this vast area. When we look at Asian business systems, we are obviously having China as a very important actor. We have Japan, and then we have Indochina. In particular here, we're going to look at Thailand and Vietnam. We also have the Asia Pacific, meaning then the other countries in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and there are huge differences. I'm going to go through this hopefully in a way that you can find that there are certain patterns that these countries are following that are based on history, that we can find examples from recent developments that we can directly put into a context of history, where we see that these nations, they have been shaped by culture, of course, but also by external influences, at the same time as there have been strong developments internally, shaping structures, businesses, the society as a whole. I'm going to see here if I can continue here. What am I going to talk about? Basically, about the variety in general and the regional features, because there are huge differences between these countries, between climates. Take, for instance, what we see in Japan and in China, all the differences that we see. Take, for instance, between Indochina and the regions where, they have tropical climate, they have certain traditions. We can say that this region of the world, they have all climates. They have all topographies. They have huge differences between cultures, religions, languages, not to mention that. When we look at these things, we put it into a context of business systems. After all, that's why we are here looking specifically at the business, how it's coordinated, what makes managers manage the way they do. Are there any differences that we can highlight, and then what are the reasons for that? I'm going to specifically talk about Japan, some words about China, quite much. About South Korea, why South Korea is different from Japan and from China. We have also a great, I would say, a very important factor in the ethnic Chinese working, coordinating their activities from a number of countries, and they following this bamboo network. I will come back to that. Then, of course, we have the Southeast Asia with countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, which is a little bit different from their way of structuring their businesses is way different from what we see in Japan. I will try best I can to explain why. I will try to give some hints about the underlying factors behind these countries' economic development. In the 90s, they were known as the tiger economies. They collapsed later on. I will give some brief information about the reasons for that and what we can expect from them in the future, perhaps. Also, I end this session here with some reflective questions, and then my idea is for you then to write about it. I mean, you will read this book, hopefully, and find that many things here are worthy of looking into. And a good way to do that is then to start to write about the information that you find about the questions that I'm asking. And then, well, perhaps we can arrange some discussion forums on the course platform. By the way, I said that hopefully in the course introduction that we're using the SEO platform. That is, we're not so dependent on the course website. I would like to keep all the information on the SEO platform. And then you can post your reflections, your ideas, your viewpoints there. I will try to put together discussion forums so that we can, well, keep in touch during these sessions where I will be using the video. There will, of course, be chances to talk to me later on when we meet, but I come back to that later on. So we should not worry about that right now. Let's continue with this session then. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are huge differences between the countries, between the economies in this region. We have, for instance, take Japan with its very strong culture, also very strong internal market, with its system of developing businesses in a way that is sometimes good for innovations. There have been several what was named as the Japanese miracle, where we saw that a number of companies were very good at using ideas, innovations, many times from the West. In fact, many of take for instance the Japanese quality system, there were in fact American engineers working in Japan, transferring their viewpoints about, take for instance, the Deming cycle, the viewpoints about how to manage quality, and the Japanese companies adopted that, and not only that, they developed it further. They developed into something that the rest of the world have been using, have been I would say very successful in. So when we are looking at Japan, we have to look at this country from a viewpoint that is a driver of technological innovations. We have so many known global brands coming out of Japan, and the Japanese economy is very strong, although they have had their share of problems. We've seen the Japanese economy being basically at a point where they were really, really suffering. Let's move on to China. We see that obviously they have had a development since, after the Deng Xiaoping coming into power here, that has meant a tremendous change to the Chinese economy. Obviously, they are very into developing their internal market, but they are also, as we know today, very dependent on export, both to the United States and to Europe and other countries in the world. South Korea, well, that's another story. They are definitely influenced by their neighbor in the north. They have a history being, invaded by the Japanese army. They have had a situation with the Korea War, etc. They have a situation where they were forced to develop their country from being in ruins after the war into creating something that is dependent upon exports, dependent upon developing a strong infrastructure for innovation, also for creating structures, making it possible for capital to be channeled through a number of I would say structures into certain industries which are then named as very important for the South Korean economy. Then, of course, we have the regional ethnic Chinese. We have a lot of Chinese communities all over Southeast Asia, all over the Pacific region. We have them I would say everywhere. But in this particular region, they play a very important role in keeping a business structure that trades between Chinese communities in other countries, creating something that has been very successful in developing a business structure that is flourishing and also being a very powerful factor in the countries where they operate. And of course, not to mention Taiwan. When we talk about the regional ethnic Chinese, obviously we should not forget about Taiwan, which is a very, very strong, influential country, and a country that has meant a lot for the development of this structure of ethnical Chinese communities working together in different countries. Then when we look at Southeast Asia, primarily today I'm going to talk about Vietnam and Thailand. Obviously, I can't go into all the details. I hope you excuse me for that, but it's going to be some information about what characterizes their way of doing business. When we look at Indochina, we find that basically we have Burma, or, well, obviously it's a very close country, it's part of Indochina. We will not go into that. We stick with Thailand and Vietnam. Southeast Asia, then, I almost forgot here, please forgive me. We look into the Philippines, we look into the Indonesian economy and the Malaysian economy. Basically, that is what I mean when I say Southeast Asia. So, let's continue. You see that we have the different areas here that we are talking about, and as you can imagine, it's a huge geographical area, and not to mention it's densely populated. We find quite many cultures, we find a lot of different languages, habits, norms, values guiding people in these regions. And we know from history that there have been certain regions that have been very stable and others have been unstable, mildly speaking. So we also see that there are a number of factors today that is affecting what's going on in this region. I mean, they have the ASEAN trade zone, which is not exactly the same as what we find in the European Union, but it's developing into something that works in a similar way. Also, I mean, we have a region with tensions, political differences. Take, for instance, China, which is a communist one-party state. Compare that with Japan, where we see a totally different way of democracy. We see other countries moving in that direction. But we also find countries where we have a different way of looking at politics. Take, for instance, Thailand with its monarchy. It's been very strong. We have, I should say, over the years, obviously, we have seen that there's a Thai parliament which have been subject to some, I would say, conflicts over the last decade. Let's move on. So, we find that there are quite many varieties here, and when we talk about the varieties, it's important that we understand that some of these varieties are because of geography and culture. Obviously, culture that boils down to people's beliefs, norms, values, and that comes through religion. We find quite many religions in this area: Buddhism, Taoism, not to mention the Muslim countries. We find Catholic countries. We find another. It's not a religion, Confucianism. It's more a moral code which affects some countries a lot, others less, of course. We find that we have countries that have long traditions. The Chinese, for instance, I mean, everyone knows that they have been a superpower if we go back in history. We know that, for instance, Japan, they closed their borders during a certain time, during, I can't recall the name of this shogun, but he was very persistent in closing all the borders. There was one, I think, was it a Dutch trade station that was allowed to be the only touch point with the outer world, but apart from that, they closed their border. At a point in time, China did the same, closing their borders, saying that everything that is needed for the Chinese population, for the Chinese society, can be found in this country. China is not interested in developing any business with any other country because the products that we can bring from there, we can do them better ourselves. So there are some certain traditions of looking at the country and looking inwards. What can the country do? Then, of course, we have varieties based on the fact on history of the countries. I talked about that already, about China and Japan. But after the Second World War, we can label that as the in modern history. We find that the period here between 1945 until 1975, that was a very important part. And then we have a second period after 75 until 97, the growth of the tiger economies. And then we have a third period after 97, where we see that there has been growth and also less of wars. And no wars and economic development, that is something that is easily understood, of course, as uh, two factors that come together in shaping the society, making it easier for businesses to develop compared to a situation where we see that there is a risk of war and no investors are interested in investing any money in a country where there is a high risk of a war starting over the next 12-month period. So we see that in this region we have quite many factors affecting the economic development and obviously also the way that managers behave. I will come back to that later on during this course, that management styles, the way that companies coordinate their businesses, that is something that is very, very highly affected by all these things. And then we come back to the role of the company in society, the role of the religion, the role of the leader. What we can find here are differences which in some cases have historical roots. In other cases we see that the influence from the outside, meaning from the West, from other countries in the world, have been very strong. Let's continue. I said that the first period here, during, after the Second World War, we find obviously the Korean War, the Vietnam War, terrible things happened. We also had guerrilla wars in Malaysia, not that much perhaps covered in Western media. There was a civil war in Indonesia and numerous confrontations throughout Southeast Asia. In China during this time we had the Communist Party coming to power with the chairman Mao Zedong initiating this great leap forward. Later on during the early 70s, starting the Cultural Revolution, which costed China dearly, in both in terms of people's lives and also for the economy as a whole, for the country, for its businesses, for the livelihood of people in general. So we can say that this is a period that shaped many of these nations. Still today there are in fact there's only a ceasefire between North Korea and South Korea. There is no signed peace agreement between these countries. The effects of the Vietnam War, it was devastating, and the Vietnamese have then turned from being very closed society into opening for new investments, opening for some influence from the West again. When we look at the period of stable growth here, what was happening here is that we saw a rise in foreign direct investments, the FDIs. And also we saw a new government being formed in China after Mao Zedong's death, with Deng Xiaoping coming into power, then looking at the economy a little bit different, or I would say a lot different from what used to be the case during the Cultural Revolution. It's one of the quite many historians, they quote Deng Xiaoping in saying that for the economy it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black as long as the cat catches rats, meaning that do we really have to control all businesses, or should we open up for some entrepreneurs starting businesses? And that was something that changed the Chinese economy a lot. Obviously, after the war, a lot of Japan's economy, many Japanese cities were in really bad shape, in ruins in some cases, not to mention the atom bombs over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. After that, the Japanese economy came back, starting, obviously it was a very difficult period for them, but still they managed with something that international observers call the Japanese miracle. Basically taking huge leaps forward, becoming a leading nation in marketing new innovations in high-tech sectors, in the car manufacturing industries, in shipyards, in heavy machinery. There were a number of sectors where Japanese companies placed themselves very high up on the, I would say, the companies that were leading the technological development. Also, we see a situation here with South Korea after the Korean War. Same thing, people coming together, building up the country, creating an economy that channels its investments into certain areas, developing industries that are into creating a foundation for building the economy on exports. Then we have something, the ersatz capitalism. That was also something with the build-up of the tiger economies. We could see that there were many countries getting easy access to foreign capital. Also governments supporting this development, but not really checking if this is a good investment or if it's an investment that is a little bit shaky. And this thing led to, well, if there is too much capital in the market, there might be effects later on with inflation, with projects turning up into disaster. And that is exactly what happened in take for instance in Thailand with tourist resorts and in fact even, I wouldn't say cities, but at least small towns being built on the assumptions that people will move in there. There will be people who could spend a lot of money, but then when the bubble bursted, it was shown that, well, there weren't any buying power in the market that could meet this, I would say, this overgrown housing and real estate market that had been created by the easy access of money, by the easy foreign investors trying to basically outbid each other. They were so into thinking that this market is something that is going to grow. It will keep on growing, but eventually that did not take off. So this said, with the ersatz capitalism, we can say that that was the foundation or the reason and the cause for the Asian financial crisis, which also, of course, affected Japan. Then finally, we see the period of reform here, and starting after 97 and still ongoing here, with the trend of globalization. Many ways we see the important role of China in this development, with market economies growing not only in China but also in other countries in this region. Huge investments in modernizations in companies and in infrastructures. Also learning from the ersatz capitalism, looking at what can be done to prevent these things from happening anew. Also efforts to reduce favoritism and corruption. Not that easy, but these things have been very important factors in the corruption-ridden countries in Southeast Asia. There were examples earlier on with the Suharto administration in Indonesia, for example. That was terrible examples of corruption, and there are many other countries where we have seen similar patterns with corrupt public officials draining resources from the business sector, from the society as a whole, not creating any investments from the resources that they drain from the economy. We can't say today that they have succeeded finally, but they have taken serious steps ahead in this direction. There's a lot still to do, but again, things are moving in a positive direction. Let's keep it at that. We can't say that the battle against corruption has been won. That's too early to say, and I don't know if we ever can say that. It is a phenomena in society that has been going on for centuries and thousands of years, and we can't expect it to end abruptly, but at least there is some hope, and that hope's from increased transparency and also some reduction of the nepotism, the favoring of certain groups, certain people to which you are related either by family or by some other contacts in the networks. We have seen a growth of international standards, growth and increase in education level in these countries, a rise in the professionalism, and I mentioned already adapting democratic systems of governance. And these things, when they come together, accountability, transparency, adoption of democracy, we see that these societies tend to take steps forward, increasing the wealth of the population. And we have to remember, well, looking at these markets, we have to remember that they are huge internal markets. And this is something that is beneficial for companies outside this region. It's beneficial for companies at global level. Finally, we find the CSR, the corporate social responsibility, also something that had been, I would say, seriously overlooked earlier. And I mean, we've read about the sweatshops in Thailand, in India, in many other countries where companies have abused workers, where companies have abused the environment. We've seen examples, again, with corruption making this possible. We have seen examples where companies starting to move in a direction, taking responsibility for what they are doing, preventing abuse of labor, preventing abuse, take, for instance, creating regulations for child labor, creating regulations for how many hours employees can work. Of course, there are still many examples, terrible examples of companies abusing these regulations still, but again, there are at least there are someone pointing the finger at them saying that, hey, you should not do this because we have certain standards that we need to follow, and to cooperate with companies in the international arena, you need to have a certain level of corporate social responsibilities that you maintain, that you develop into something that is acceptable. When we look at the varieties in the business system here, we will find that there are certain things that we need to consider, because since they are interlinked, it may be very difficult to analyze them unless we try to pinpoint what it is that we are talking about in a business system. That varies. In this model, we see that there are quite a number of key factors of variety, and I will go through them here, and as careful as I can, hopefully you will see a pattern here. Basically, we see that on the second level here we have coordination, we have order, and we have meaning. When we look at, for instance, a coordination of a business system, obviously ownership plays a very critical role. And there are different systems. The Japanese system with the Keiretsu, I hope I pronounced that right, they have this Keiretsu is founded on something older, the Saibatsu. That was another example of me trying to pronounce something in Japanese, but yeah, never mind that. We have the Korean Shaibol, which is different from the Japanese way of creating ownership structures. In comparison with the Chinese family-owned companies, the families, the people who are related to a family, plays a very critical role in the way that the companies are managed. When we continue into the network area here, we see that I mentioned that earlier on that the Chinese population living outside of China, they play a very important role in their economies, and one of the reasons why they do that is because they have this network with other Chinese communities with which they can develop trade, they can do business, and they can get access to resources, financial resources, labor resources, and natural resources. So there are quite many things. When we look at the Japanese networks, how they are created, they play a vital role in the Japanese production systems. I will come back to that later on during this course and also later on today. The networks of the Korean companies were the important role, but also the way that I would say that there are similarities between the Korean and the Japanese, but they are not entirely similar. When we look at the management style, we find that there are differences in this region between the top-down management, where we see that there are very strong leaders being very obeyed by those at subordinate level, and that is something that comes natural for people. There is no questioning. If the leader says that this is what we should do, people in the companies, they do it. If a leader in the public sector says that this is something that we need to do, people obey and do not question. Then we have other countries where we see that we find more participation and more, I would say, fair processes, more democratic system built into the structure that the companies are organized. We find, I would say, democratic systems in the companies, and obviously there we can't say that we have this top-down management style. It's more, if not bottom-up, so it's something in between, or we would say people are allowed to take initiative, encouraged to take initiatives, and this is something that is, of course, affecting the way that companies are coordinated. Um, let's move into the midsection here with order. Obviously, capital plays a critical role here in being, um, in a country where we see that there are certain sectors where we find the main investors, and these investors also are in a way coordinating their activities with the local networks. We find that there are some countries that are more effective in attracting foreign capital, companies coming to, say, for instance, China, making direct investments, building companies there. Same thing in Vietnam, Thailand, etc. We see differences here between, say, for instance, Japan has not been that open to foreign investments in a way that we see in other countries in Asia. When we look at the human capital, that is obviously an area where we see that education plays a critical role. The qualities of the labor force, the way that they also coordinate their activities, the way that the human capital becomes something that is a source of growth, a source of development, something that makes these countries develop into new innovative areas. Order also deals with social capital, meaning that we can basically say that this is forms of trust. Should we trust the system in society, or should we trust our friends, our relatives? And again, a country with companies that are based upon family businesses, obviously they trust people in the family, while not so much into the societal systems as a whole. We can also find that there are in the social capital a way that, well, things get done in a certain way. That brings us into meaning, into rationalities, and why things become rational in a system, that is, why people choose to do things in a certain way, in this way, and not in that way. Because it's based upon cultural factors, it's rational to do it in a certain way. When we look into identity, that is something that deals with the core ideas in society. And again, this is an area where we see that the religions play a critical role. We see that the view on the persons versus the country versus the community versus the state is something that is critical here. Do I identify myself as an employee of Toyota, or am I a citizen of Osaka? What is it? Well, in this case, it would be, for a Japanese, for instance, likely that the identity comes with employment, being someone who is working for a certain firm in a certain city. Authority then, well, basically this deals with the way that power is exercised. When power is exercised, that means that there is someone also listening, obeying. So we cannot only look at the way that power is exercised. We need also to look at what happens next by the people who are supposed to execute these decisions, these policies. And here we find differences between the countries, and we can say that there are examples where we can say that the way that countries have been changing. Take the Korean example. When you read about it, you will see that the 5-year plan that was set in after the Korean War, that had an effect on the way that people carried out their responsibilities in reshaping the economy, reshaping the country, creating a very strong industrialized nation that became a very important player in the international market. Oops, something happened to this slide here. I hope you can forgive me for this. When we look at a business system, again, I can't overemphasize the role that culture plays in the structure. Because culture affects the way that people's behavior, people's thinking processes, the way that they or you and I see the world, the way that we interpret certain signals, certain words, certain symbols. And that is something that affects the economy and the society as a whole. We find here that in the middle here they talk about institutions. There are many important scientific articles on the effects of institutional change and institutional processes. And many of them, in fact, they point out that these institutional processes, they tend to be self-reinforcing, meaning that they get stronger and they tend to make people look at things, accept things, or reject things. They tend to be very stable over decades, over governments, in contacts with foreign companies, in contacts with domestic companies or companies in the region. The institutions tend to be very stable because they have been founded on cultures. And although there are cultural changes going on as we speak, there are also cultural factors being very, very stable. And one of them is language. Take, for instance, what we think, what we are talking about today, that are things that others have said, thought before us, and that is transferred into today's problems, today's situations, opportunities, threats, etc. And these things tend to come back into looking at these new problems, looking at them from an old perspective. So when we look at the way that societies are formed, we cannot rule out the influence of institutions, which affects organizations and management. Management styles are definitely affected by institutionalized structures. It can be, say for instance in Japan, where we see that the educational system is very reliant upon companies training their employees further. In other countries we have other structures with the educational system being supposed to train people very far, and that is something that is developed outside of the business sector. I've talked about the structure of family business contra the Japanese kairetsu and the Korean chaebol. So we find that these structures are institutionalized and hence very stable. Meaning that they will not change overnight, because they are so deeply rooted in society, so that any change would take decades after decades after decades. This said, the only constant known to man is change, so that changes take place, but they take place within these institutions. And what we see today will continue to change, but in some areas these changes will be very, very slow. So let's move on to this business system elements, and I'm going to go through these in a way that you see that we find that I talked about ownership, networks, and managements as the upper part, where we see that here we have a sector, an institutionalized structure which coordinates the way companies do business, the way networks in the different countries functions, the way that managers control their businesses, their decision making, meaning their strategies, meaning their everyday operations. We find that there is a material logic behind the order of capital here. We have a certain technological structures that affects the way that technology is implemented. It is dependent upon investments, obviously. Is the infrastructure in place? Can we put in this system here? Which is also then again dependent on the human capital. Can people in this region really operate this equipment, and do they know how to handle this equipment? We've seen great leaps in many countries in this area. Moving on to the social capital here, where the impact of the external ideas, norms, values shape the interactions and shape certain features, functions that we find in these organizations. We find that the meaning structure here, the cultural founded meaning, making certain behavior rational, while others that perhaps for a foreigner might seem irrational, is perfectly okay in this context. We find that people tend to develop certain identities depending upon where they are living, what type of profession they have. We find that, again, authority creates a foundation for the way that power, I take that back. We find that authority is something that tells us about structures for executing power in these business structures. So when you look at this, remember that we can say that a business system is, we can find that there are mechanisms for coordinations, there are mechanisms for order, and there are mechanisms for meaning. If we can remember that, then we can fill in the other boxes and try to create some understanding about how they differ. I would say that this model is perhaps something that is very interesting for those of you who are going to, well, all of you are going to analyze developing markets, and I would think that this model can then serve as a structure which you can apply on this market, so it's not only something that is valid for the Asian business systems. I think that we can extend this model quite further into other areas where we see that we can analyze a business system with help from these elements of coordination, of order and meaning. So let's continue. When we look at the business system here of Japan, we find that there is something here in the ownership structure here with the Keiretsu or Sogo Sosha, where we find that the ownership structures are very integrated in the sense that there are cross ownerships, meaning that a supplier owns part of a customer and a customer owns another supplier. That these networks tends to be very stable in the sense that they have a trust in the structure. They have what they talk about here is patient capital. Long-term investment, long-term growth, not the rapid demand for returns that we see in the Western societies, rather long-term investments, seeking the way to benefit not only from immediate successes but long-term successes. And then we find that there are quite many areas where we find that this has been something that benefited the Japanese economy greatly. But also we find that this patient capital structure was something that was devastating in the sense that perhaps Japanese companies did not change as fast as they needed because they were too integrated into this Keiretsu system, so that there was no demand for them to change and to reorganize and to develop new products, or perhaps even more important, shut down operations that was no longer generating profits. On the other hand, well, we have not seen the end of the story, so it's very likely that we will see this structure generating new innovations, generating another technological miracle. So that this said, we need to know that they talk about the lost decade here with the stagnation of the Japanese economy, and saying that this is something that was created by the patient capital. Well, maybe perhaps we can explain it by that. It's one of the reasons. On the other hand, we've seen what the short-term view on capital investments can accomplish. So that's and not all of that is positive. That is a totally different way of looking at things and leading to rapid changes in the labor market, leading to unemployment peaks and also situations where quite many wished for a situation where the investors would be a little bit more patient with their expectations of companies coming back with returns on their investments. When we look at the social capital here, we find that there are quite interesting structures here. In Japan, they at least they say that the trust is at a higher level compared to in other countries, meaning that people trust the system, the market economy, the way that the overall economy is coordinated, the overall way that the structure are set in place. There is a higher trust in that in Japan compared to in other countries. And we also see that there is an unusual high cooperativeness between companies in different sectors. There are industry clubs, there are a number of coordinating mechanisms, creating the foundation here for trust. Creating a foundation for stability, for also progress, dealing with difficulties, etc. And also, I would say that there are quite a number of factors here that we can find historical, traditional Japanese ways of dealing with things that forms the foundation for the social capital. What we are looking at here I've been through this meaning section already, so that it is, we've seen examples with the Japanese employees coming to work, say, 30 minutes earlier, although they're supposed to start at 7 o'clock. They're there 6:30 doing some workout prior to the start, and led by the manager, and this is something that will help the company to be more efficient that day, and everyone's taking part in this exercise. The identity that comes from being an employee of a company is very important. Many times we've seen examples, although this is changing, and in some areas changing very rapidly, with companies moving away from the lifelong employment into employment structures that are more, let's call it westernized, in the sense that people will get laid off if there is no need for them. And again, obviously this is something that may affect eventually the way that people identify themselves as workers of a company or something else. We find that the structure overall here have been creating very successful companies. That is something that is undeniable, and we can see that many ways of the Toyota quality management systems have been replicated by so many companies around the world. We see the just-in-time system that's basically based upon the Japanese way of thinking about quality, and not to mention the Kanban system, total quality management structures being adopted by Western managers, and also the thinking that a problem should be solved as close to the problem where it occurred as possible, meaning that there's room for the group to deal with the problem. They have authority to do so. And also the thinking that managers need to move around, working in R&D, working in sales, working in production, working in service, etc. And this is a way then to create very stable structures that can be also flexible in creating managers who are knowledgeable, not only in R&D but also in the way that these products are produced. They can understand the way that customers look upon them because they have worked in service departments, etc. So we see that the way that power is exercised in the companies, I would say it's of course it's top down, but it's also bottom up and a delegation of authority. Now I need to have some water and move on to the next structure here. This is interesting because when we look at the business system of Japan here, we see a cultural structure that is based upon the notion that firms exist to keep people employed. I talked about the lifetime employment already, and the role of a company then is to provide an identity, and then it makes sense then that we have a conformity to group norms, because these norms are the things that creates an identity, nationalism in the Japanese society. And this is not something that has been developed recently. It goes back centuries and centuries. I talked about the institutional structures here with the patient capital, and this, as I mentioned, this has benefits, but there are also downsides, like in any structure. We know that obviously the Japanese companies being structured the way they are a little bit rigid, but we see a development with flexibility gradually stepping into loosening up the very stable structures that have been in place over the decades here, and also highly qualified labor force, well educated, further educated in the companies, being motivated, being encouraged to take on initiatives, come up with new solutions. I talked about the coordination here with the Keiretsu being a very important factor with the cross ownership, and again with the patient capital, meaning that we can't push a supplier too hard in negotiations, because as a matter of fact they own part of our company, and not only that, they also have ownership in our customers. So we play it safe here. We continue to do business here, and things will work out eventually. This leads to a complex coordination among businesses, among politics, among bureaucrats, because it's so intertwined. It's difficult to change something, because then you will immediately affect something else. And finally, also coordination, of course, important here. It's based upon consensus among managers and employees. It's a consensus about what we do here is for the benefit of all. It's something that is, again, has been replicated in quite many management books around the world. I taught, for instance, in Texas, and quite many things there were basically Japanese management systems being transferred into the US system, but under some different concepts, but basically the same things, creating this consensus thinking, creating this understanding of how to deal with the quality improvements, how to deal with the innovation structures, how to define customer demands, how to redefine products in accordance with these ever-changing demands. So let's continue here. How Japan can continue its development. Well, we see that innovation and adaptation, as I mentioned, that is one very critical driving force here. It's one of the hubs that must drive the development of the economy. And we also see that organizational change is necessary. We see that organizational changes are taking place, moving away from the rigid labor market into something that is more flexible, and being used to be the world's second largest economy. We see that the growth of the internal market is critical for the Japanese economy, and then obviously something that many Japanese companies are dependent upon. That is very important to remember, although we know that there are so many global Japanese brands, they still need a stronghold in their domestic market, because that's their foundation. So I think that we can leave Japan for now. Hopefully I've covered some key points here, and you can of course read a lot more about Japan and find out many more interesting things. And in fact, I encourage you to do so, since obviously I can only scratch the surface during a lecture like this. So since I'm on that path, I continue with China. As I mentioned here, China here, we have a different structure here. We have family-owned businesses, and this is something that is very interesting, because there are, of course, important networks, but since we have the ownership structure being based on families, we have another important factor, meaning that it has become the workshop of the world. We also see a very, very interesting development with Chinese companies starting slow, adapting new technology, using new technology, going into innovating new technology, identifying new niches for the technology, and then developing into a key point position in the global market. Of course, not all companies, but in some areas. The ownership structure here again is interesting, since we see that the heritage of the companies differs a little bit from what used to be the tradition in the West, where there was a certain way that, well, usually the oldest son inherited the family wealth. But in China, in the Chinese structure, it's distributed on all the kids, and obviously that can lead to conflicts. Well, it usually does. And this is something that affects the lifetime of Chinese businesses. Also, it affects the way that they are open to foreign investors. Many companies are in fact very dependent upon foreign investors, others are not. When we look at China here, we see that obviously today China is criticized for, I would say, doping their currency, and that is something affecting world business in many areas. And we see the US putting up certain taxes on imports from China, saying that this is something that is necessary, since the Chinese currency, the yuan, is undervalued, and this is something that needs to be corrected, and the European Union following this view as well. And of course, this is something that is likely to, well, affect world business ahead of us. It's going to be interesting to see what comes out of that. We find that the structure here is, again, we find that the human capital is important, meaning there is a reason why China could be the workshop of the world. There is a huge labor force, perhaps not that well educated if we look at the millions of Chinese workers, but they are certainly quick to pick up the innovations, and there are quite many examples of Chinese companies being successful in hiring highly qualified employees. But they're basically, the human capital is based upon numbers, the huge size of the workforce. And obviously this is something that we have seen quite many companies moving into China, taking advantage of cheap labor and developing new ways to use this resource, if we call it that, and then setting up networks where Chinese companies becomes a very important partner, a power factor, since the access to this, with all the licenses you need to work in this country, it becomes a resource in the way that certain parts of the value chains are outsourced to China, taking advantage of the human capital, which is accessible and also at a low cost. I better get some more water here because I'm getting a little bit better. If we look at another thing here, which is important, we see that Confucianism plays a very important role. Confucianism is not a religion. That is important to remember. It's rather a way we can say that Confucianism are norms. It's a code that people should follow in their relation to each other. And important. They talk about the 5 principles here, and that all of them deals with parents and children, between the private individual and the state, or the emperor. These things tend to create a structure, stability, and of course also meaning for the way that things happen, the way that they are organized, the way that we look at things, or those who are following the Confucian tradition look at things. Let's continue here. I mentioned that family-owned businesses are important in China, and then it comes back to the Confucian tradition here with the centrality of the family. We also find that there are hierarchies of rights, duties, and mistrusts as well. And not necessarily a performance-based value system. There are certain things that we need to do because another person, according to the Confucian way of looking at things, we need to behave in a certain way, and that is not because of that person or that individual have performed in a certain way, but the way that we are prescribed to do so. And also, of course, with China being a country ruled by the Communist Party, we find, of course, strong communist values in many sectors. When we look at the institutions, we find a number of I would say ineffectively allocated capital, and the state banking system have not perhaps been that efficient in allocating resources to the areas that can generate the best returns. I talked about the huge labor force, relatively unskilled but trainable, willing and able to change and to learn new things, being interested in developing new knowledge in new areas. So the fact unskilled today, that is today, that doesn't mean that we see the same things tomorrow. On the contrary, we can expect huge changes. Weak social capital, but again, do not trust societal structures as such, but trust the family structure, being the structure that is coordinating, which can be trusted. Again, it goes back into the Confucian tradition, keeping the family in the core. Coordination here, we see that obviously socialist market economy, basically it's a hybrid. And we find state-owned enterprises, quite many of them, and local enterprises, and of course a widespread private sector enterprises working all over and together. creating a structure here with the varieties because of different forms of ownerships. And can be a little bit tricky for those who are investing in China here. Are all companies open to foreign investments? Well, many of them are, but then what does it mean to work in a joint venture with one company being owned by the state? It can be difficult, it may be easy. Well, there are examples ranging from very difficult into being, in fact, rather well working. So we see that there are quite distinct differences if we compare the Chinese business system with the one of Japan. How can China then succeed in the future development? Well, we see that the coordination here with foreign capital, it's still a country that needs foreign direct investment. The FDIs continue to be very important. Another important hub is, of course, the scale and scope about this market. It's huge. There is no other word for it. It's huge. It's enormous. And another driving force is the growth of the internal market. I mean, that's an area where it's a tremendous growth potential in here. And again, this is something that is attracting a lot of foreign investors. If managed together here, it might be something that can facilitate future developments of the Chinese economy in many ways. Of course, there are political tensions, there are developments that may counteract this development, attracting foreign direct investments, and well, we have to wait and see what happens. Where we see, when we look at the Korean, or I should say the South Korean business system here, we have to look at the fact that we have very important networks. We have structures here that is very much dependent upon the coordination of the network. We see that we have a structure that resembles Japan in many areas. We see that the business system here is perhaps with a stronger influence from the South Korean state in creating a structure for export, developing businesses, companies, networks that are internationally competitive. And doing that, we find that there are certain things. Overlook the meaning here, the meaning structure, and go directly into the order structure. We overlook that one and go into the meaning structure, where we see the same thing as in China, with the Confucianism being very important in affecting the ways that the South Korean business system functions. I'm going to continue with this one. Horizontal personal relations, meaning that, again, the network works horizontally. Colleagues in different companies cooperating and being a member of this network, strong personal relations, having this strong sense of nationalism. And in the book they talk about Korean companies exist for the purpose of strengthening the nation. And this is interesting in many ways, since, compared to Japan, firms exist to create employment. Here we say firms exist for the benefit of the nations. And this is again, we see a very strong institutional foundation where the state plays a very strong role, and we have a strong, high respect for professionalism and administration. New institutional structures being created, law, finance, accounting, organizational structures and technology, and reforms opening up after the crisis in the late 90s here, driven by the market-driven rationalities, and looking at ways to create flexibility. Coordination, looking at the coordination between the state and the Chaebol, creating important supply chains between companies, coordination, cooperation. Management here, we see centralized top-down structures, authoritarian leadership, long-term thinking, long-term planning, long-term investments. Also with the Confucianism comes the respect for seniority. Merit systems are very important in the Korean structure. Let's move on here. How can Korean businesses and the Korean economy continue to develop here? Well, we see that here we have innovation and adaptation being very important. Innovation, I mean, if the country is going to be competitive in the international market, then obviously they need structures that facilitates that. To be innovative, you need to have organizational innovation as well. And here we see another thing, again, a country which is dependent upon the growth, the development of the internal market. Basically, we can say that these are three important forces. We can say that, of course, being export dependent, there is still a need for a strong domestic market, and this is important to remember. When we look at the business system of the regional ethnic Chinese throughout the Southeast Asia, we find that the networks, the bamboo networks, are really important. Coordinating production facilities in many countries here. With the Chinese economy, the Chinese communities being powerful economic factors in the regions where they work. Management, well, they say laissez-faire in the book, but there are certain things pointing in that direction, but we also find structures where there is authority, Confucianism with these traditions, creating structures which are not laissez-faire. We see on other hands, we see economies that are self-developed. So in this sense, we see laissez-faire when we look at there is no real government influence over the development of these economies. They develop by themselves, and they have been doing that greatly. And for instance, the example of Hong Kong is one area where we see that the laissez-faire economy could be quite efficient in creating economic growth. Of course, there were downsides as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean something bad. I'm running out of time here, so I better move on to this. What characterizes the business system of the regional ethnic Chinese? Obviously, their culture, the identity as being Chinese within another country, within another culture, with the language barriers, etc. We have the Confucianisms and the China Circle, linkages between mainland China and Chinese communities overseas, which is, of course, very important, and creating continuity, creating stability, creating, of course, also huge investments in mainland China done by ethnic Chinese in other countries, sharing the same culture, sharing the same language, having the network in place already. Personally owned businesses dominated by the small and middle-sized enterprises. The SMEs are definitely in majority when we talk about the regional ethnic Chinese, their business community. Being diligent, being reliable and non-political, and that is of course being spread out in many countries, being different in terms of culture and language, etc. Don't get mixed up in politics, focus on business, being a non-political structure and being accepted as such. I talked about the bamboo network already, but partnerships and family groups are very important for the coordination of this business system. I do think that when you read this chapter, you will find this is a very interesting way of coordination, and it would surprise me if not someone said that I would like to look into this, because we see Chinese communities in the United States, in Europe, and obviously they are developing similar structures, but in this region we see that they have a very strong influence on the economies in the regions where they work. We can see, when we look at these networks, we see that there are definitely political tensions and strong state control in Taiwan. There are very strong, successful manufacturing industries, high-tech industries, and also U.S. research facilities, and located in Taiwan, being of strategic importance for the Taiwanese economy. If we look at Hong Kong, for instance, we see after being a formal British we under the part of the British Empire, now becoming a part of mainland China, we see that there is a special administration in this region. I think that they will continue until, say another 35 years, something like that, being a specially administrative region. There is this laissez-faire economic policy, meaning that the government do not interfere that much in control in certain areas. Again, there might be changes in some areas going on as we speak, but in general we find this pattern. And high quality infrastructure being built to serve this local economy. We see, on the other hand, a Chinese community in Singapore being based on a development with a very strong government. So it's quite the contrary if we look at, if we compare them with Hong Kong. It's also entrepreneurial, being based upon science and high tech in a number of sectors. So when we look at this China network, we better extend it beyond the Chinese mainland, because it's more than that. Hopefully this slide here tells you a little bit about where we can expect to see similarities and differences as well. When we look at the business system of Southeast Asia, obviously China and is an emerging market, but here we see definitely an emerging market. When we look at these countries, we find that there are problems with corruption. I mentioned Indonesia already with the Suharto scandals and the things that have continued after that, corruption problems in the Philippines, etc. And also the problems with the ersatz capitalism, meaning capital being basically poured in by foreign investors, creating hyperinflation, creating investments in certain projects that did not take off because I would say the purchasing power of the middle class was too weak to meet these investments. We can then say that this is an area that is, of course, still developing, catching up after the financial crisis in 1997 that was devastating for these countries. And we see that they are gradually coming back, of course, natural disasters like the tsunami disaster and was devastating for Indonesia. And but again, we see that there is a strong interest in developing the business sector, and we know that they've done it before, and it's likely that they can come back into do it again. What is interesting here is that we see a legacy of in these countries in the Southeast Asia. We have a legacy of colonial structure. We know that I think it's the US today that has the strongest influence on the Philippines. Indonesia used to be, let me see here, I come back to that later. It used to be a strong colonial influence, same for Malaysia. I talked about the problems of the ersatz capitalism already. And because of these problems, basically with corruptions, one common denominator where we see corruption-ridden countries is that there is a very, very strict, rigid administration, and this doesn't really cope with new technology, and there are fees for licenses, there are some under-the-table payments, and there are demands for bribes, etc. Obviously, we can't expect then people to trust the system in general. There is definitely a quite low level of social capital, meaning people trusting the system. They have no reason to trust because they know about its problems, but they also know how to deal with the problem. We see the coordination challenges here is these countries are emerging markets, and there is an inflow of foreign capital, and meaning that there are challenges in the clash with foreign companies entering the markets, bringing management, bringing administrative structures, and then for local companies to catch up, adapt, and cooperate with these companies. That may be something that is quite a bit challenging for companies in this region. There are reforms. There are reforms towards greater openness. There are demands for openness and for rational resource allocation, not continuing with the ersatz capitalism, investing in wrong areas, etc. More professional, more market-oriented, in the sense that investments are made in areas where there can be some return on these investments. Let's move on here. With the legacy of the being colonial governed countries, we find that in, for instance, the Philippines, we have a land-holding aristocracy and also an ethnic elite consisting of Chinese and also foreign companies in this region. And then, I mean, for instance, Philippines distinctly different from the other countries in being a Catholic country, for instance, comes back from the Spanish colonial structure. If we look at Malaysia, then we see a strong British influence, Malayish orientation. Today, many manufacturing industries, investments in education and development of the workforce, creating a workforce that is capable and also in attracting investments, in the sense that companies that come there can expect people to be knowledgeable in this technology and able to develop new things. Indonesia, then, we see that have a legacy of being influenced by the Netherlands and also by the Suharto dominance, and also quite substantial dominant economic role of the ethnic Chinese. And again, there have been tensions between the economically dominant Chinese versus the Indonesian nationals, and again we see the development of the bamboo network and the structure of the Chinese business structure being attacked because being wealthy, being a little bit upper class, perhaps earning a lot of money compared to local communities suffering from poverty and a lot of associated problems. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into this one directly here, looking at the business system of Indochina. Basically, here we see that we have, of course, Confucianism is an important part of the culture, but here we see also Buddhism, very important in these two countries. And the philosophy of sufficiency is, again, a reaction perhaps to the financial crisis of 1997. And it doesn't mean that the country is closing. No, it's not that. It's basically means a moderation between the different actors in society, knowing that coordination is necessary, perhaps some also sharing of wealth, more fair distribution of wealth in the country is preferable, because that creates a more sustainable market than if it's too concentrated in certain groups. If we look at the Thai economy, we need to consider that also strong Thai institution. Country has never been, have been subject to foreign influence, of course, but compared to many countries in the region, has never been a colony of any European country, and it's very strong, constitutional monarchy, and strong traditions in many areas. If we look at Vietnam, by contrast, then we see quite strong French legacies, Confucian ideals, and today a very strong central government being led by the Communist Party. And we see obviously many low-cost producers moving into this country, taking advantage of low labor costs, of course, but also the fact that very interested in learning new things, a labor force that is adapting to new technologies, seeing the benefits, seeing the opportunities in doing something in the country. Coordination here. Again, the Bamboo Network. I talked about this already, so I don't need to talk about it. The Doi Moi means, I would say that this is a milestone in the Vietnamese economy, meaning opening up the economy after the Vietnam War, or as the Vietnamese describe it, the American War. And that was done then in 1996, opening up the country for foreign investors, for foreign companies. Of course, still keeping very strict control over things, but at least it's a step towards integration towards international markets. Foreign direct investments in both countries, and we do see that both countries have state-owned companies, and there are also private companies owned, managed, run by domestic actors, but there are also foreign direct investments in both countries. We see that both countries here in the business systems, they have quite favorable environment for foreign direct investments, and there is a certain base for where companies already have developed strong manufacturing infrastructures. There is technologies, there are transporting structures in place, and given the fact that, I mean, many things goes to a neighboring country, meaning to China, meaning to Taiwan, perhaps meaning to Japan, these structures are in place, and there is a dominant influence in the region here by the Chinese Thai population in Thailand. Obviously, in Vietnam, we see that it is still run by the Communist Party's socialist market economy. It's a low labor cost country, but also turning into a country with a skilled, trained labor force. I've chosen not to say so much about Myanmar, about Cambodia, about Laos, focused instead on Thailand and Vietnam. Those of you who are interested can, of course, see if there are similarities, differences with respect to Thailand, Vietnam on one hand, and then Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos on the other hand. So, it's now time to round this up here. And what I think you can do here, when obviously you need to read the chapter here, and when doing so, I mean, there might be things that you think about here, and is it possible to compare Pacific Asia with Europe or Latin America, and consider which region here contains the most variety, and what is the basis of that variety? That can be one example. Can we compare different regions in the world? Another question could be, what do you think should be included in the description of a country when doing business if someone asks you to explain one? Should we go through everything, or should we go into certain specific areas? Which factors do you think are the most important? I know that during this lecture, I've talked about let's call it the macro structures. But there may be other things at, let's call it a meta structure. Something that is more hands-on for companies that they need to think about, that they need to prepare for. Another thing to perhaps think about is why Japan have an income per capita of about $40,000, why China has only reached $4,000. Might be something to think about. And do you think that one day we will see car manufacturers in China on its own developing cars that are equivalent of a Lexus? What do you think? I talked about the Japanese global brands here, and list the global brands that you can think of from Japan and China. And what does that tell you about the nature of the industry in these two societies? Perhaps something to think about. And also, finally then, in how many ways can we say that Korea is halfway between China and Japan? Can we make such an analysis? Is this something that is possible to say that, okay, it's not China, it's not Japan, it's something in the middle? Well, interesting to see what you come up with here. Again, you don't need to go through all these questions, but I strongly suggest that you pick the ones that you find most interesting and you write something about that. It helps you to remember. And again, as I said when I started this lecture, this can be something that can be used when analyzing other countries as well. And such assignments will be part of this course. So smart if you have a structure to conduct this analysis. Okay, that was all for today. Thank you for your attention and see you later on.